Hello and welcome everybody to this week's edition of Truth to Power. My name is Justin Mogg. I'm one of the programmers here at Forward Radio, and the whole idea of this show is that every week we gather different programmers from around the station and different people from around the community to take on issues of the day. And I'm really excited to have in the virtual studio with me today a couple other programmers. We have Ruth Newman joining us from her home, host of Election Connection. Hey, Ruth, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm
Yeah,
good. Glad to be here virtually.
glad we're getting you out of your house, quote unquote, today.
Exactly. Yes.
Also,
Virtually out of my house.
right. Also in the studio with us again is Hart Hagen, host of the Climate Report and Let's Talk. Welcome, Hart.
Hi, Justin. How are you? Great to be
Great.
here.
Great. I'm excited to be interviewing once again our special guest with us. Actually, this time we've doubled the guests. We have with us the two co-founders of Beargrass Thunder, Jody Dahmer and Mariah Corso. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, you got it. Nailed it. Thanks for having us.
And
And the
Oh,
kitty.
there's the cat.
we have all kinds of mammals represented
Yes.
today
Right.
on Forward Radio because we're going to talk about nature and natural systems, and I guess we're going to probably focus more on plants than other things, but plants are the basis for the animals, right? And so
Absolutely.
it's very appropriate that we have your cat joining us as well. So y'all want to tell us about what Beargrass Thunder is and what you do and how long you've been around?
Yeah, here, I think, let me put my cat down really fast.
Yeah.
She was a little grumpy, but, so, could you repeat the question one more time?
Just tell us about Beargrass Thunder. What do you all do? How long you been around?
Yeah, sure. Well, Beargrass Thunder was initially just a concept. The concept started last year, last February to be exact, when Mariah and I moved into Bashford Manor, into an apartment building very close to a tributary of the South Fork of Beargrass Creek. And so what really sparked this whole company was we wanted to make the alley in the back of our apartment building just a little bit safer. And so we asked the Metro Council to help, and what they really said was, well, you need to have it come from the community. You know, we can, it's the budget's tight. We don't know how to help. You need to find it within, you know, the residents.
And even though a lot of these alley spaces can be public space, it's because they have a lot of tiny slices of private ownership that all butt up against them.
So what we decided to do was we actually went door to door with coloring book pages, and we had a laminating machine, and so we were able to actually generate from the neighbors about 60 different pieces of artwork that we were able to hang up within a week. And once we hung up those artwork, all the grandparents who were homebound in the neighborhood took their grandchildren out into the space because they both contributed to the art. And so as a result of that, it single-handedly dropped the amount of crime and the amount of arrests in that alley space because there were so many more eyes on that street.
Yeah, the art really made it feel more homey, and it also added like a piece of everyone from the community. A lot of people even dug maybe the old paintings that they had gotten from Goodwill or whatnot that didn't really get put up in the house anymore, or and stuff like that kind of made it out there. A lot of antique pieces, and even like stuff I still had hanging around from high school that had been, you know, sitting in the closet. So that was the first half of the Cummins Alley project. And also Jody really did a lot by planting a bunch of native plants in the area too. And it really basically answered this issue of a food desert for the animals that were living there.
Because the alley behind our apartment building, it had been built in the 1950s and not maintained for about 3 decades. So we had all these cracks in the asphalt. People didn't feel safe parking back there. There were so many, you know, dips in the road and everything. So what do? Well, wherever there's a crack in the asphalt, that's perfect for planting something because it's already there. You don't have to dig anything up. And so we put in a bunch of sunflowers, and we actually documented 30 different species of birds coming into the parking lot. And if it could happen in a parking lot, imagine what we could do in a neighborhood, right?
I mean, eventually, just by planting so many seed-bearing plants and whatnot and kind of attracting the birds, we actually ended up seeing a hawk in the area. And
Wow.
a lot of the residents that had been there for many, many years were shocked by the presence of the animals.
And so it goes to show that, you know, in neighborhoods, this was only a mile from the zoo.
Mhm.
But the problem was that it was on the other side of 264 with no way to actually get direct access
Mhm.
to that area. So for a lot of residents, by just having that plants out there and having that art, that was as close as they could get to a public art space, a park, and
Mhm.
without a vehicle. And so because of all those different concepts, a lot of other neighborhood groups started reaching out to Mariah and I specifically on, hey, could we maybe pay you to do this in our neighborhood?
Yeah.
And so that's how the business got started.
So now we really go from neighborhood to neighborhood to try to figure out exactly what they want their alley to look like.
Because every alley is different.
Yes.
Wow. And I bet you were particularly effective, speaking of the differences of different alleys, right? Your alley is right there along Beargrass Creek. And we humans don't think of the creeks as like infrastructure, right? Like we don't think of them as roadways, but the animals do, right? These are the flyways. These are how animals navigate our urban spaces, right? So, of course, if you can make your area attractive to critters of all kinds when you're near a waterway, well, that's gold, right?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of gotten us even into something that really Hart has even inspired us on, is which, you know, like, why are we using pesticides, and why are those going into our creek, and what are those doing to all the animals that really could be adding to our community?
And what we found was that for the longest time, the hotel was trying to do anything they could to prevent what they considered weeds from growing. And they thought that anything above 2 inches tall was unsightly. They thought residents wouldn't like it. But the switch was, when you switch all those 10-foot high Johnson grass with 10-foot high sunflowers, suddenly everybody loves it.
Not a weed anymore.
It's not a weed if it's pretty, right? So what's really fun is that just because we decided to plant sunflowers and make that space, they didn't have to spray chemicals that year. And so as a result, I think that there were more birds that would have been able to survive in that space, you know, than if they had decided to just round up the whole area.
Yeah. Can we talk about the whole ecological principle, this idea that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail? This just happened to me because with pest or herbicides, because I'm a guerrilla tree planter in our urban jungle, right? And there are all these empty tree wells all over the city. And anytime I see one of those, and then I see a little seedling coming up somewhere, I move it over into the tree well. And I try and weed around it and water, get it established. So I even put stakes up, and I did this around the No Middle School and Manual High School recently on my bike commute to work at U of L. And someone just, you know, only had a hammer, and so they came through with their Roundup and they were spraying the fence line and decided to do everything in the tree well too, even though it was clearly staked, right? Like this, how can you look at that and not see the goodness that someone's trying, right? That this is clearly intentional.
Right.
So
just find every weed and destroy it.
Absolutely. This is something we're actually addressing in our newest alley project, which is turning more to a concept, but we have something going on now in Roland Street Alley.
Which is in Shelby Park.
And we planted a number of donated crops, from bok choy to cabbages to lettuce,
a ton of tomatoes,
a lot of tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, large tomatoes, you know, and we were just wanted to see how it would do on the side of a building, kind of this industrial side. So,
and so we tried calling the city and we said, hey, is there any help that you can give us? We were trying to do urban agriculture in an alley. And the first question they asked was, well, have you tried vacant lots? I don't think that concept will go very well. I don't think that'll be successful.
Right.
And so we did it because we got permission from the landowner and everything else. And so once we put that out, it was amazing to see that now they are trying to figure out what kind of permit best incorporates that use of the alley, right? Because before that was a complete no-go. And now that we've done it and we've showed that we could actually theoretically cram 50 plants into a 200-foot stretch of place, like that could feed a neighborhood if you do it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to show people that that's part of the ecosystem here. And part of the problem, though, that we're ending up having is we weeded it. We kind of made it a plot of land. We put everything out there. But because Jody and I do work on volunteerism, grass, chickweed, normal kind of typical weeds kind of grew up around it. And now we're kind of having the issue of what the property manager is asking now, what is with the weeds? And so the question is, what are the weeds, though? Right. And now he kind of wants to perhaps go out and indiscriminately spray Roundup. So like with a hammer, everything's a nail. But when I look at the whole patch, I see a whole ecosystem, weeds and plants and food and food for the butterflies and birds and whatnot.
And we actually were able to document 2 spice bush swallowtails out in our alley. We planted 5 spice bushes out there just as a ornamental. And I was able to photograph 2 different butterflies that were now laying eggs in the alley.
3 of the 5 bushes have eggs on them.
Yeah,
so it's really cool that just in the past 3 months, we were able to bring species that were functionally extinct in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then that's a draw for foot traffic, right? For people to walk through the alley and enjoy artwork, enjoy plants, enjoy insects, butterflies. And so that all in all creates a human plant ecosystem. And not to mention that it downplays crime, and it encourages interaction among people.
Yeah, and the best way to experience an alley, from what we found, is that the more foot traffic you have, the more people complain about cars speeding, because that's another big issue in alleys. Because you either want especially nowadays, you either want to get through an alley as fast as you can, or you want to go into an alley to not be seen. And so,
by putting up the art and the plants and whatnot, we're giving reason to slow down, or perhaps even take the alley for reasons that aren't illicit, or
illegal dumping, especially
illegal dumping or anything like that. Just to walk down the alley. Alley should be for people and for the communities that are around them to enjoy. And when we did the Kemmons Alley project, we don't live against the Roland Street Alley project. It's a very different one, perhaps, than our Kemmon ones. But because we lived at Kemmons, we knew all of our neighbors, which was wild. Really, truly. Like, it just, I didn't expect to know them. And we knew the people in our building. We knew some people in the buildings beside us. We knew people across the way. And it was all because we were outside so much. And we were kind of available to be spoken to. And it created a sense of community that I didn't expect to get out of it.
And that's the way people used to live in cities, and I guess in small towns too. People used to hang out outside on their porch, or taking a walk down their alleyway or whatever they had around them. And I think in this pandemic, we're especially reconnecting with that older way of being, right? When we're all told to stay at home and there's nothing to go out and do formally. People get sick now. They do have the internet, but they get sick of just, watching Netflix or whatever, and want to get outside and talk to people. And this is a way to do it in a socially distanced, safe way, right?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
No one could ever say the pandemic is a good thing, but if anything good does come from the pandemic, I do think it's utilizing our outside spaces in a way that we weren't honoring beforehand.
And what is really interesting is that most of the urban core of Louisville was built before automobiles were invented. And so all of the alleys actually do a very good job of connecting the arterial roadways inside the neighborhood specifically. So what I mean by that is that for a pandemic where we all have to stay 6 feet apart, how can you cram everybody onto a 4-foot sidewalk on Bardstown Road or along Poplar Level? If we utilize our alleys, then we got every resident as a way to spread out through the neighborhood and still get to where they need to go.
Or with just more enjoyable, just just more enjoyable, outdoor spaces for all of us to enjoy. I think, as coronavirus happened and we also kind of saw an uptick of like walking outside, it was kind of this challenge of what do I do when I pass by people? How do I socially distance while I'm still on the appropriate like trails that are set out in parks or these appropriate public park spaces? And how can we kind of maybe perhaps bring in our own neighborhood into where we could walk and feel safe and use?
You mentioned earlier that like the only reason people go to alleys is if they're just trying to find a quick route through, or if they're going there for illicit reasons. But alleys are also where we like hide the stuff, right? This is where we put our trash, right? And so we don't want people to see how much trash we produce, and we don't want to see the garbage men, right? We want that to be just somewhere else, right? And so we use the alleys for that purpose. But I love this idea of reimagining them as vital spaces, right? That we all could actually treasure and use, and it just takes a reimagining of how we do it.
And I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Especially with the commercial spaces, if we were able to bring outdoor patio seating and outdoor serving to the alley side instead of having everything fixed on the parking lot side of things, you got all of that space that is used for vehicles, right? But when it's 100 degrees outside and people would rather, have something to do at the place of business, underneath some shade or some patio seating, whatever else, you have to kind of make this decision on, do I want that parking lot to be for cars, or do I want that parking lot and the alley extension to be for people? And what we're finding out is that a lot of the neighborhoods that are built around the alleys, they could probably actually serve more people if they converted their parking lot.
Yeah, I had this exact experience last weekend when I went for brunch at Flora's Kitchen on Barrett. And that's a great vegetarian restaurant, by the way. And they've eliminated their indoor seating because of the pandemic. And I didn't even know. They were like, oh, you could, I saw these two tables out front in the blazing hot on this cramped sidewalk, right? And I thought that was the only option. And they were like, oh no, you haven't seen our secret backside. And it's, of course, it's the alley side where I've never looked before, but there's trees. They've planted it up with some nice planter beds for veggies and other things, herbs, and it's just this lovely little garden all of a sudden. Now it's not like fancy, but it doesn't need to be. It's just a delightful space, and it almost felt like being welcomed into a secret, underground. It almost felt like a little bit of a European experience. Like this has happened to me in Europe, where there's these magical little back corners you never knew about.
Awesome.
And they really know how to use all of the space in a city. And I think you're right, that like this pandemic is forcing us to kind of reimagine in all of these spaces, right? And
exactly.
to value people over cars and over parking. And like, what if we put people in a parking space? Like think of how many restaurant customers we could have in a parking space. I noticed just in pedaling through Schnitzelberg the other day that Monic Beer Company has done that. They've put in barricades all down the what used to be street parking along their restaurant on the Hickory Street side, and it's now all outdoor alfresco, safer, more pleasant dining. How cool is that?
And that also slows down traffic.
Yeah,
pre-pandemic, that would have been so many permits, so much red tape, so many no's. And, it's really interesting to think, when need comes, what can we really change? And what can we change our ideas about what our needs are as human beings here? And
so, that's part of what we're working on with Metro Council currently, is that to do the alleys the way we want, we actually need to change a whole lot of ordinances, unfortunately, because most of the ordinances are written by people who take a car to work, who have a lawn, who think it's normal to do that. And, when we come in, especially at first, they kind of laughed us out of the room, thinking that, it's like, well, why would anybody want that? But what we've seen is a lot of gardeners and a lot of native plant enthusiasts really want some changes to happen in the land development code. And so I'm actually helping to lead a push to change some of the crosswalk parts of it. Currently, there are no ways to actually paint a crosswalk across a state highway. It has to go through a $50,000 traffic study.
Right.
You know, you can only paint one color of paint on the road, and that's white paint. So
that's still very, very hard to get approved.
yes, and anything else that you try to paint, the city will actually call the state government, and the state government will come and tear it up.
Yep.
So
We've seen that
really,
when they tried to do some colorful crosswalks just here near the Hayburn building on 4th Street as kind of like a reclaim the streets effort along 4th Street. Well, they came through and said, well, this is actually a state highway, even though it's clearly just a city road, right?
Yes.
And you can't do anything not normal, right?
yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's so funny that we were kind of touching on all of the big topics that Beargrass likes to think about, because our other thing is talking about how many roads in some of our lower income communities are one way and are considered, unfortunately, state highways.
Mm-hmm.
And how many of those roads just in Louisville are state highways, and kind of talking about maybe perhaps getting more control back into the city on how we need our transit and the cars that we do have to run, and perhaps the transit system.
Because the only way people can safely use the alleys is if they feel safe crossing the street. Because if you use an alley and you feel unsafe crossing the street, you're not going to let your kids or your grandparents go out there because you worry about their safety.
Urban issues are just very, very different than rural issues, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you make a lot of city roads owned by the state, you run into issues where perhaps worlds can't quite understand the different needs there.
Yeah, because I mean, the state, KYTC's got this sort of rural highway mindset about everything. And again, it's all they have is a hammer. So they apply the same designs and criteria to every state highway, no matter where it is in the state. Well, if you're in a countryside, it's completely different needs from 4th Street in Louisville or any
Absolutely.
downtown, right? Our guests today here on Truth to Power are the co-founders of a great organization, now company, called Beargrass Thunder, Jody, Dahmer, and Mariah, Corso. And we've also got in the virtual studio with me, Justin Mogg, Ruth Newman, and Hart Hagen. I've been talking a lot. Hart, did you have anything you wanted to ask these folks about?
Well, it seems to me that this kind of lends itself to some scenarios where you might be able to close off some streets. I read recently, I don't know if it was Portland or Seattle, someplace out in the Northwest, where they decided to close off like a 20-block area, something like that. And so, what would be possible if that, is that a scenario that we can entertain?
I think that would be like my ultimate dream for our mile-long alley project that we kind of have in the works. And it's a alley that runs halfway through Smoketown and halfway through Shelby Park. And if we could get that closed off to vehicles, I think it would make an amazing thoroughfare down from West Broadway and kind of the Family Health Center all the way back up to Logan Street Market. And you know how exciting kind of that area is going right now. And it could be all bike, all pedestrian, and kind of see what that would look like. So I would love that. Hart, I would love it.
And the trick is you want to make sure that you can still, like, if you are closing off a street, you don't want that to impact neighborhood connectivity, because that is something that Louisville does not have a lot of. I actually linked in the group chat. I do map making as a trade in my day job, and so I actually did a whole series of maps mapping whether or not you can get from neighborhood to neighborhood in a straight line. And it turns out there are only 2 roads in the entire city of Louisville that connect from the West End, Shawnee, and Chickasaw Park to the East End in a straight line, and that's Broadway and Oak Street. And so, if we are able to use the roads we have, but look at them and reimagine them in a different way, whereas like there are some roads like Shelby Street, Oak Street, where it goes one way, two way, one way, two way, and it goes in a completely different direction in one neighborhood than it does in another. So if we're able to take some of these ideas that Beargrass Thunder is talking about, but try to say it on a citywide level, saying like, hey, driving is fine, but wouldn't you rather have cars be optional instead of mandatory? Like Sweet 16, yeah, you might be doing that once, but do you really want a car for every single one of your kids once they turn 16? You
I would
know,
say maybe you're just getting older, and maybe driving isn't just something that you want to be dealing with a lot more of. It can be dangerous and scary, and not everyone's a good driver, and not everyone really wants to be out on the highway or out, on the roads in a vehicle technically all the time. But we feel kind of like that is a part of our independence and a part of kind of how we're part of our community. But what if we didn't have to have that to have independence and community?
Because everybody loves to complain about parking, but what if we didn't need it at all, right?
There's also this related issue of ideally we would have neighborhoods in which we can live, work, play, and what else, but not have to leave the neighborhood or so much just to eat. Have places where you can eat in the same neighborhood where you work, in the same neighborhood where you live.
Yes. It's also like, especially food dependency. You need to make sure that, like, my dream is to increase the biodiversity in every neighborhood. Like, if we could put in the ordinances that every neighborhood needs to be an arboretum aspect, where like of course not every tree will survive in every area, but if we could say, hey, instead of having a requirement right now in the LDC where it's only 2 tree species in a new development, let's at least make that 20, because the next emerald ash borer that comes in, if you only plant 1 tree, it's only a matter of time before some problem occurs. So let's plan for the future now instead of just trying to plant the fastest thing.
Right, and it seems to me that these biodiverse alleys that you're talking about seem to solve a number of problems at once. I've listed 6.
Hart.
You absorb carbon. You're letting things grow, so you're absorbing more carbon. You've got wildfire. Like when you don't mow, you just let things grow. You've got more wildflowers. You've got more trees. These wildflowers and trees absorb water, so there's less going into the sewer system. You've got places for wildlife, and Dr. Doug Tallamy, who I get a lot of my cues from, says that even 15 minutes a day in nature it has comparable measurable benefits to mindfulness meditation. So when you're surrounded by nature instead of surrounded by sterile lawn, then that's it's a whole big thing.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that the whole notion of diversity and sterile lawns. That where was I going? People have the habit, they've been in the habit for many decades now of getting in their car, going to work, getting in their car, going to pick up the kids at school, getting in their car, going to shop, and never really having the opportunity to get out into the world, get out into nature, and interact with other people. And that is the way our cities are laid out now. And we've got shops, we've got malls and parking lots and institutional buildings where people go and spend all of their day. Now, what you're proposing seems to me is creating more opportunities for people to get outdoors and encounter each other, not be encapsulated in their cars where there is no form of communication or engagement other than accidents.
Yes.
But when you're on a bicycle, when you're walking, you're out there, and you're and that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping that during this pandemic, where we really are not going shopping that much, we're not getting in our cars that much, maybe some of this will start occurring to us, that we really have a need to be out there, engaging other people, encountering our neighbors. And if we make places non-sterile, more interesting, then there's more reason to be enjoying the outdoors, not just having to go to Bernheim, but actually in our own neighborhoods.
And the thing about Bernheim is those birds migrate. So those same birds in Bernheim, they're gonna fly over Louisville at some point.
I think
And vice versa. Bernheim needs to borrow our birds, butterflies, and bees. Bernheim can't, the wildlife that's there is going to migrate. And you know, there was a German study that showed that over a course of 40 years, there was like a 75% decline of insects in natural areas. But even, you know, these preserves, they're not completely isolated from all of the, you know, the chemical pesticides that we use.
Absolutely.
So just saying.
Wind blows,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
Plus,
And
Justin
water
was,
runs and everything is
yeah,
interconnected. Yeah.
right. And Justin was talking about, you know, the waterway. We don't think of the waterway as infrastructure, but you know, the waterways can either be clean or dirty. You could either eat the fish or not eat the fish. And if assuming the fish are edible, if you have trees and wildflowers that host insect populations, then you know, another thing Dr. Talmy says is that like 40 or 50% of fish protein is derived from insects. So if you have habitat for insects, that eventually has a positive impact on the fish populations. And I have a personal degree of resentment for the fact that you can't eat the fish out of the Ohio River or other waterways. I mean, you know, how do you, wouldn't it be great if you could actually fish and eat what you catch, et cetera?
Exactly. And part of the problem that we run into, especially when we talk about Beargrass Creek, is that in a city like Louisville, where there are generations of family that have grown up here, a lot of the older generations have seen Beargrass Creek as a place to dump. You know, that was the dumping ground. That was the way that their grandfathers did it, and you know, that's what it was. And so now that we're coming in and saying, hey, we want to make this better, and of course we have momentum with the Army Corps study coming out soon, and you know, this federal money hopefully coming in to restore it. We really think that by just changing and marketing this as kind of an asset, instead of saying, oh, you know, I'm in District 4, you can also say I'm in a Beargrass Creek neighborhood. Because if we're able to visualize all of our neighborhoods as running along this waterway, anything upstream that someone dumps in is going to make it down eventually.
I think two things I'd just like to put in on what Hart said is that, one, I like to promote, like, the bugs are good, and that, like, in our Roland Street Alley project, we might not be eating those vegetables, but a lot of bugs are, and those bugs need food too. So I like the idea that everything is kind of being eaten by someone, even if it's not maybe a person. And then the second thing I wanted to mention about fishing in the Ohio, or just kind of maybe getting our food from a more local source, is that I think that's an amazing sustainable way to kind of answer, you know, how can we eat meat, or how can we eat just kind of in a cleaner, more sustainable way. And eating local and in season is a way to kind of cut down on all those emissions on transporting that food and whatnot. So, you know, that just being able to feed yourself locally, I think, is super important. And I'm glad that you brought that up.
And you know, there are places that will allow like rain gardens and wildflowers, but they don't allow you to grow food because of the zoning regulations or whatever. But we need to be able to incorporate growing vegetables, especially vegetables have a lot of water in them, so it takes a lot of carbon to transport them over a distance. If we could grow food where we are, you know, you can have vegetables, and you can have fruit trees and nut trees, etc. We can get more in the habit of thinking of every plot of soil is a place potentially to grow food. So
yes, and every food scrap is a potential food that, if it were composted correctly,
or if you have chickens,
could be recycled back onto people's property, which doesn't happen that much. It does happen in rural areas, but it does not happen in the cities. In restaurants, we prepare our own food, and that food ends up in the trash or in the sewage treatment plant, rather than renutrifying the soil where it actually belongs.
This is such a rich conversation. There's two things that we went over too fast that I want to go back and get a little more information about if I could. One, the most immediate thing was Jody mentioned an Army Corps of Engineers study that I don't know if I'm aware of and potential funding there. And then I also want to go back to connectivity of our streets. But first answer that about the Army Corps thing.
Sure. So the Army Corps of Engineers has actually partnered with MSD August 15th, 2019. And they announced a partnership to do a feasibility study, a 3-year feasibility study. So we won't figure it out until 2021. But it's they both put in 1.5 million each for 3 million total to look at how to restore all 3 forks of Beargrass Creek.
Wow.
So going South Fork, Middle Fork, and Muddy Fork parallel to I-71. Now, the implementation of that is going to be after the feasibility study, and that's probably going to be a source of federal and state grants. But because we've done the feasibility study now, we've actually unlocked potential federal funding later. So I really am excited because if we can get a lot of people on board now that own property along Beargrass Creek, you know, when this feasibility study comes out, we've already done some of the legwork, right? And then we've already moved that finish line a little bit closer, you know, so we don't have to wait 2 decades for something to happen. So it's you know, every little bit helps, and we're really excited that the Army Corps is actually looking into doing something, because, you know, I don't know if you know, but Beargrass Creek, the South Fork, once it gets past the Louisville Zoo, it actually gets channelized into a concrete ditch. And so it's really hard to even slow down the water at all, because it was built to channel that water out of the neighborhoods as fast as possible. So we're seeing a lot of lack of birds and lack of biodiversity there. So anything would be great in District 4.
Yeah, and it's a concrete ditch near where I live, which gets to my other question about the connectivity and your post. First of all, I want to direct listeners to your awesome website, beargrassthunder.com, and you have a neat thing going on right now called the Isolation Vacation.
That is the current series of videos that we're making.
Yeah, with some resources for folks. So I want you to talk about that too, but there's a post specifically, I guess it goes back to May, but a post about awkward maps. And the little image there, I'm looking at, I'm like, hey, that's my neighborhood. So my house actually sits on Lambton, on a pedestrian court that intersects Lambton, and Lambton Street used to connect with a bridge right across Beargrass Creek, and now, you know, it's kind of awkward for us to get in and out of our neighborhood.
Yeah, and I can talk a lot about that because I have tried to do research on that.
You live at one of the 3 specific bridges that we like to talk about that used to exist back here in Louisville and no longer do. The bridges, from what our research has shown by contacting the Metro Council,
as well as the archives at the U of L.
At U of L, yeah. So they've helped us out a lot. Barbara Sackton-Smith's office has helped us look up a lot of this information. But all the bridges used to be wooden, specifically in these 3 neighborhoods. They were more farmer-driven and built by the community.
Man, I've thought about stringing up a rope bridge, you know.
Absolutely.
Yes, and back in the day, it was all completely rural back then. And so the Catholics and the freed slaves that were pushed out of the city center, they were moved into the bottomland around Beargrass Creek. And so in order to connect across the creek, they actually built bridges themselves. And but the problem with that
is that there's a lot of flooding, obviously, that we still experience today around Beargrass Creek. So as the 1800s rolled on and whatnot, some of these bridges just couldn't be maintained by the community. And finally, in 1937, when the large flood came through, the only one remaining, was it the one at Lambton Street?
It was actually the one at, yeah, it was Lambton.
It was the one that you would live right by. That was the final one remaining. And the 1937 flood took out that bridge and many of the bridges that were in the more traditionally like white and affluent neighborhoods as well. So the state came in with relief money to help rebuild a lot of these bridges, and the bridges that we rebuilt
were Swan Street, Schiller Street, and Ellison Avenue, and those only connect white neighborhoods.
And so then the 3 that we have mentioned before they were not rebuilt.
Yes, and so we asked the state archives. The state has no records of those bridges actually existing. And they actually also don't have any records of the planning process as to why Swan Street, Ellison Avenue, and Schiller Avenue were built. So everything was just, it is what it is.
So we like to call it the awkward maps of Louisville because I think it's a little awkward to talk about maybe why we rebuilt those bridges in our more affluent white neighborhoods, and we kind of let down some of our lesser, our not lesser community, but our lower income and lesser viewed upon people in our city who should have been taken care of as well. It also highlights a lot of those one-way streets that we like to talk about that are 4 lanes wide and owned by the state, and only the state.
And they only start turning one way at Beargrass Creek.
Yep.
So, it's very interesting because when we go to, we like to talk about this to as many council people that will listen.
Yeah.
And what we have found is that when you talk to council people from a more affluent area of town, like when I mentioned this to District 8, Brandon Cohn, he actually mentioned that Breckenridge Street was a bad example because it is 2-way.
And in his neighborhood it is.
Yes.
Not in mine.
Yes.
So exactly. So it's just kind of, we want each one of our neighborhoods to be livable and amazing and be able to have that community, but it's kind of like what happens when maybe some of our community neighborhoods aren't financially stable, and you need to get out of those communities to get items, but we have persistently made it our travel and our roads in a way to make it difficult for those communities to get into these other areas.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to accessibility, and we want to make sure that every neighborhood can be functionally independent when it comes to sourcing food. That, if we can make that happen, and if we can use alleys, and if we can use the public spaces that we already have to do it, I mean, I like to say that agriculture grows on you after a while,
Jody and Mariah for mayor.
Yes.
We really appreciate it. Thank you for bringing up our website. And also, if you guys like anything that we've talked about today, we also do have a series of YouTube videos.
About 30 hours worth.
About 30 hours worth of stuff. And always, we're always trying to put out new stuff. Like I said before, our series now is called The Isolation Vacation, just trying to put out some content on things and educational content on what we can do during the pandemic and whatnot.
I can vouch for the fact that it's all very professionally done. When they get to a part that you think might be boring, you have Jody walking real fast, like fast forward past that part of the video so you can get to the meat of the matter.
Oh my gosh. No, it's honestly very entertaining for us. This has been a creative outlet for us, during pandemic and during COVID. We really just, it's been hard, so
I mean, we've really expanded what we did. We started with one little alley that we just was behind our house and kind of wanted to make safer, honestly, for us and our neighbors, and it's turned into a whole YouTube channel. And honestly, we like to include all of these different topics we've touched on today because we believe in making Louisville better, and we want all of Louisville to be better.
And the last thing I want to say about it is that all of these concepts are also very cheap to implement. Most of the artwork were used by sourcing donated goods. We actually have been contacted by Youth Build Louisville on potentially getting teaching these concepts to teenagers, and then the teenagers can actually make the art concepts themselves.
Even though we're licensed as a business, we've yet to accept any money, and we've done everything off of volunteerism and donations so far. So we definitely intend to keep forward with that, and any of the money that we eventually do profit, we hope to just keep putting into the alleys that we are doing.
So Jody and Mariah, when you're mayor, what are you going to do to your neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods?
Well,
two-way streets
for sure. And also, I'm going to paint a crosswalk on every alley in this city. I'm telling you, I'm going to put bright colors on it. I'm going to make it rainbow. It's going to be gorgeous, and it's going to be legal.
I think Louisville really looks at ourselves, and we kind of go forward into reimagining these alleyway spaces and perhaps lawns and just kind of what community can be for Louisville altogether. I do think that, ultimately, that's like our dream for Louisville, just to kind of make it a new age city that's going to be post pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have a real opportunity here to create a new place in a new city that Louisville's never seen, and I think that we could all enjoy.
Mm-hmm. And if we can make it, maybe instead of a city of parks, why don't we just make the whole city a park? Why don't we just make the whole city a forest or a prairie, or, you know, different areas have different rainfall. But
and unfortunately, as you know, global warming keeps going, that does mean that Louisville, where we are going to experience this increase of tropical plants that may start to, you know, be viable here, and citrus fruits and whatnot that we could explore. You know, it's all about the balance between keeping things native and making sure that something's using it, bugs are pollinating it, something is eating it, and trying to keep out invasives, but also maybe exploring what the change in climate can do for our community and our outdoor spaces.
If you're just tuning in, this is Truth to Power here on Forward Radio, and we're talking with the co-founders of Beargrass Thunder, Jody, Dahmer, and Mariah Corso. And you can find out more about them at beargrassthunder.com. Check out their over 30 hours of videos in the isolation vacation. Take some virtual walks through alleys and local parks and things like that. It's a great way to get to know hidden treasures in your city. And they've got a bunch of great posts on their website too about all kinds of hidden gems and things you might not have known. We're talking about rewilding the city and revaluing public spaces, and really thinking of our city as a commons, right? It's a public commons, and our streets are public commons. And you know, the chants we hear down at Injustice Square now are whose streets are streets, and I always particularly love that one because that's how I feel every time I'm on a bicycle on our streets.
Yes.
And when I hear that, you know, I know that some people, unfortunately in Louisville, when they hear whose streets are streets, they think that the streets belong to everyone, but really I think that's what that chant's about. Whose streets are these? They're all ours. They're our public streets. They're every Louisville citizen's. Everyone is here to enjoy them.
Even if you don't have a car.
Yeah, and I think it's for, you know, for every race, creed, religion, color, like these streets are our streets, and we really need to reclaim them and what we can use them for.
So when Cece the cat is vice mayor, then her special project is going to be to get rid of chemical pesticides, because when she eats a mouse that's been ingesting chemical pesticides, then Cece gets sick.
Absolutely. And Hart, that's actually a great thing to bring up, because we actually, the reason we have two cats, CC and BW, and they're both elderly. And actually we adopted them from the outdoors. They spent the first 8 years of their lives outside, and unfortunately are both on their way out now. They're old. They've enjoyed being inside with us last 2 years so much, but we are very convinced that because they did drink out of a creek that they lived nearby and only had access to water that was in an HOA that was a chemically treated lawn, we do think that their lives are ending much sooner, because you're absolutely right. I think everything that they consumed and everything they drank out had unfortunately poison in it. And, you know, we can also, that's just a great point to think that, you know, when we put that poison out there, it really does affect everything from the bugs to the birds to our, you know, our little kitties that, you know, our community kitties out there.
And that's
there's some people that love their chemical pesticides, and they don't feel at home if they're not breathing their chemical pesticides. So
we recommend trying to buy dragonflies.
Yes, yes. If you can do something like, well, one thing that we've actually had a lot of success with is when you mention changing lawns, especially when someone knows someone who owns a lawn care company, they get very scared that you are saying ban that business. And so
we do not want to get rid of lawn care companies at all. We just maybe want lawn care companies to ask themselves, what other services could they provide people?
They have aerating machines. They could cut prairie grass. They could do all these different services that they could then partner with native plant nurseries to fulfill. But the most important thing is we want lawns to be optional. You know, like the most important thing for us is when someone says, hey, I don't want to get rid of my lawn, I say, how much of the lawn do you use?
Right.
The lawn do you go outside in the summer and actually use?
Because there is lawn that is just purpose for lawn, for play, for enjoyment. You know, we have lots of good memories of eating outside and lawns and hanging out with our friends around fires and enjoying those outdoor spaces. But how much of your lawn do you really use? And how much of it maybe are you taking care of just for the sake of taking care of it? And that could be, you know, all these other options that we've discussed throughout the
Mhm.
our
Because
video.
It seems like, I'm going to assume that there's some equivalency between the time and money that it takes to care for a native plant lawn and the time and money it takes to care for a perfect lawn.
Mhm.
And, you know, we have immigrants coming from countries where, you know, 2 million farmers have been put out of business by NAFTA in the last 30 years. You have people who have experience, have farming experience, and then they come up here and they're on the back of the mower. I think that's a waste of talent
Mhm.
and expertise.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we need to be training people to, you know, to weed, you know, you'd have to know some plant identification skills, et cetera. But it's just, yes, labor is needed, but it's a different kind of labor and it's healthier. And it doesn't have to be a darn bit more expensive for the homeowner.
Mhm.
And if we're talking about, you know, the expense of the homeowner, especially in the areas that flood around Beargrass Creek, well, if you look at, you know, the cities is a very interesting concept because their agricultural use, they only think that you can grow grass. Whereas if you ask anybody from a rural area in Kentucky, oh, hey, I have a lot of flooding on my stream bank, they don't see that as a bad thing. That's bottomland, right? You know, like, well, yeah, I mean, of course it floods. That's what a creek does.
Right.
Like, you know, so if you were theoretically able to lease out your land in order to farm it, you know, if you're able to bring these agricultural practices into the city, assuming the soil's good and you test it and all these other variables, think about that revenue stream that you could use instead of just, you know, clear cutting every week.
Yeah, and all the in just putting in, you know, like we've said, I think throughout here, you know, putting down roots, you know, helps reduce flooding. You know, that our typical lawn, the grass that we have and we're familiar with, has very, very shallow roots, and so a lot of other native plants and native grasses that you could put in and have a lot less, you know, perhaps upkeep to do, so therefore it keeps the cost down and comparable. You know, would have deeper root systems that could help prevent some of this flooding.
I'm just curious. I'm curious. Is there feedback? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ruth.
I'm curious to know whether there are any maps of these kinds of natural gardens around town that could be demonstrations so that people could go and visit and just see what's possible here in Louisville.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Honestly, Hart, if you want me to help you with the Wild Ones survey, I got the map skills. I just need to, you know, get a couple data points. I really think that could be something really beneficial.
Yeah,
Sure,
and
I'd love to work on that. So, you know, there's Monarch Way Station, there's like Monarch Way Stations, there's the Pollinator Partnership. You have like 3 or 4 different registries of those things. And there's the National Wildlife Federation. Kentucky Waterways Alliance is the official representative of National Wildlife Federation. You have National Wildlife Federation registered, what do you call it? Registered wildlife, backyard habitats, that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of data to get started.
And it would be good for students too, because they wouldn't have to be in a classroom. They could be going in their classes outside and visiting these areas and learning.
Right.
All the biology, the mathematics, all of the various skills that they would need, learning about how to create these themselves.
absolutely. We actually have a big fan of ours. You think she mind if I drop her name?
It's good, yeah.
Melanie Milburn. She does a great job. She actually runs an outdoor school for a homeschooled children. She brings them together, and she, you know, she does exactly what you're talking about, Ruth. And I think that it could be beneficial for so many more children too, because they go out and they pick up garbage, and sometimes they check out different parks. And she just does amazing work. I'd recommend looking into it.
And imagine if we could actually do some agricultural concepts here. If I could teach an elementary school student how to make root cuttings or how to propagate plants, and then every year we do some kind of seed bank project where they just go into their backyard and harvest acorns, bring it in, then if we get scaled that on the entire elementary school, we got an entire sustainable way for every, family to be able to bring those seeds back home.
And bringing it back around all the way to our art alleys, we really want, we really also would like to include students, and we're working with Youth Build a little bit to hopefully get groups of students who have interest in art to kind of help us do some of maybe these garage murals that we're looking into, in the hopes that, we really change the perception of like, what is graffiti and how can you be empowered to make your neighborhood more beautiful
without getting in trouble for it.
And kind of give them a little portfolio.
Jody, you were saying that people are more likely to get arrested if they have the cops are more likely to check you out if you have, if you don't mow, or even if you're growing wildflowers. The safe thing is to mow, even if you're eliminating wildflowers and tree seedlings.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
So what we're seeing is that in this review of the LDC, the Land Development Code, the current restrictions that they have are that they cannot have any plant more than 10 inches high, and anything that is a quote unquote noxious weed is not allowed. And then it's up to the code enforcement official to make the final judgment as to what codes are being broken and what fines to give out. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that a lot of the gardeners in District 4 or in poorer neighborhoods, they could grow a garden, but if it gets too high, what is looking like a native plant garden to them, all their neighbors call it abandoned property. And so then they call the cops saying that they see people coming in and out of abandoned property. But that's a real concern.
Different, perceptions of what beauty is and what taking care of something is. And I think, as we've all seen, native plants can get wild. And until we've kind of have an enforceable code
that's not at the arbitration of one person,
coming out to your house to decide whether it looks manicured or not, there is that fear that if you're not keeping things looking tidy and neat, that you could be reported, and I know that there's people who have wild gardens, that we've talked to, even in more affluent neighbors, who have had their neighbors down the street kind of complain about them and talk about, they spend so much time manicuring their lawn, so their wild neighborhood yard is ruining the value of their house. It's two very wildly different views of what is beautiful.
Yes.
In my generation, if you didn't mow your lawn, you were a communist. It's the American way. It's the American way.
And you know what is really, really awkward about especially finding poorer neighborhoods is that when you say, hey, you need to mow this, with what mower? Like a lot of times lawn equipment's very expensive.
Or let's say maybe you're unfortunately very elderly and it's been very hot outside and you're on a fixed income. Who do you have available to you to come out to pay to do this lawn work?
You could do it yourself, but you get heat stroke.
And it's all about your limited funds, perhaps. It's about making more options available for more people.
And so what I always like to say is that, if you did the same code enforcement in rural Kentucky, that farmer would laugh you off of his land. If you said, oh, hey, you need to grow grass until you die. What? No, I'm going to grow food to feed my family, sir. Please get off my porch. So it's all about just we need concepts that work for everybody. And regardless of whether you own a lawn, regardless of whether you own a car, you live in the city. And if you want to feed your family on a local level using the property that you live on, we think that you should.
And that's why we really want to do this big push to get this put into code, because the only way that we know that we can ensure that everyone can do it is if it's written down somewhere, because otherwise it's kind of open to this interpretation. And as long as societal standards are kind of expecting us to do this lawn, that interpretation is still going to be that lawn is beautiful.
And it's only going to get hotter, y'all.
Good point. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. This has been such a great, rich conversation. Time has just flown by, but I do want to let listeners know that there is work to revise the land development code right now. I know that there was a meeting just on Friday about the whole issue of parking minimums, and the city is working to revise, but not unfortunately eliminate parking minimums, so that they're not so that new businesses or anything that you build in the city doesn't necessarily need a huge parking lot out next to it, right. And so thinking differently about our cities is what it's all about, and we're so grateful to have had the co-founders of Beargrass Thunder with us today to help us do exactly that. Thank you so much to Jody
And the
Dahmer,
chief feline of Beargrass Thunder.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
that is our cat CC right here. She's plumb tuckered out.
Oh.
Guys, so much for having us.
We really appreciate it.
We've had a
Thank you
good
so
time
much.
talking to everyone.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you, Hart Hagen, host of the Climate Report at 7 o'clock every day on this station. Tune in, hear lots of great stuff, and let's talk. And Election Connection with Ruth Newman is another great show. Anything coming up either of you want to plug real quick?
I'm just saying that we should be bold in what we ask for from our local government. All we want is a fair shake, a fair shot, and a fair a fair share. That's all we're asking for, and so that's what my most recent episode is about.
What about you, Ruth?
Well, the show that I just did this week, I would highly recommend. You'd have to go on our website and see it as a podcast. I interviewed the Secretary of State for the state of Washington, because that state has been conducting all universal mail-in voting for many, many years, since 2011, I think. And she is just incredibly knowledgeable about how they do it, how successful it is. They even got a national award for the security, the efficiency, and the fact that they have so many voters in Washington that vote. And the show that I'm doing this week, I don't know who knows Doug Lowry. Some of you do.
Yeah.
You all know Doug Lowry?
Yeah,
Who doesn't?
And yes, he's going to be on this week, and he's going to talk about becoming a political candidate, all the obstacles that are put in your way, what you shouldn't do if you want to become a political candidate. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. And tune into Sustainability Now this week. I interviewed the co-founders of Anti-Racism KY, OJ Alika and Terrence Sullivan, two great U of L alumni. We'll get on the station this week. So thank you all for tuning in here to Truth to Power. We'll be back in your ears again in 1 week's time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
you all.
That was great. Thank you so much.